Good morning. Yesterday, I talked about the cycle of addiction and how that plays out in the addict's life. Today, I want to talk about From Staying Sober by Gorski and Miller, recovery, the aspects of recovery and the components of recovery that lead to successful long-term recovery from addiction. A lot of people might ask the question, I know I've been asked the question, well, what's recovery about? I mean, isn't it just you aren't drinking or using anymore? And it is about far more than that, as those of us in recovery know. And we've probably all learned this stuff as we go along, but it helped me this morning to see it put so well and so succinctly in this text. And so I'm just going to walk through what they talk about here. First and foremost, they say what we all know: total abstinence is necessary to recover from an addiction. Promises to cut down are promises that cannot be kept. Any use will keep the addiction active. Abstinence is a necessary first step for recovery. Now look, we should all know this, and we should all have in our heads that there's no such thing as going back to moderate using. There's no such thing as being able to regain control over our drug and alcohol use after a certain period of abstinence. It doesn't happen. Now, we may be fooled into this by staying sober for a while, and then the first night that we drink, we're able to have just 6 that night and keep it a little quiet. But pretty soon, things will be off the rails again. Those are the stories that we hear time and time again. So they go on to say abstinence alone, however, is not recovery. In most instances, a choice to stop using is not sufficient to bring about long-term recovery and sobriety unless the decision is accompanied by treatment of some type. When I first stopped drinking, I was told by somebody that I needed to, by a close friend, that I needed to seek some kind of treatment to accompany it. And I shooed that away. I thought I could do it all on my own. And I ended up going down this very dark road to a place of extreme depression. I was doing the dry drunk thing. I was still acting in all of my addictive qualities, just not drinking. And it was a very frightening place to be. And I couldn't get out of that place until I sought some kind of treatment, some kind of specialized treatment for the disease. So, walking through the steps in recovery, the first step is detoxification, or removing the toxic substance from the body. This might involve admission to the hospital to help with that. Acute withdrawal symptoms emerge, and when the chemical is removed, that can be very serious. And so they talk about that sometimes detoxification requires help of a physician, a hospital, some situation like that in order to accomplish. They go on to say detoxification alone is not an adequate treatment. In order to maintain abstinence, much more is required. Recovery requires long-term physical, psychological, behavioral, societal, and spiritual change. Education is an important aspect of treatment. In addition, they add individual and group counseling in a hospital inpatient or outpatient program or a non-hospital residential setting are vital components of treatment. The intent of counseling is to facilitate the development of skills that will support ongoing sobriety and long-term recovery. And this reflects my experience when I went to the inpatient and the outpatient programs that I was a part of, and the residential programs that I was a part of. One of the things that I found most valuable in those programs is that they facilitated relearning things about life, or learning for the first time things about life and how to live it that I had never learned as part of my addiction. I realized and continue to realize in my recovery how maladjusted I was to day-to-day life, and how often I used drugs and alcohol to help me cope with things that regular, normal people know how cope with without having to run from. Learning how to do that, however, was a complicated process, and having a residential treatment program followed by an outpatient program, all of which included both individual and group therapy, was critical to my being able to start the recovery journey. One of the other things that they mentioned here that I thought was very interesting was searching for the cause of an addiction, such as emotional or family problems, is usually non-productive. Treatment that recognizes the addiction as a primary condition rather than a symptom of something else has been found to be most effective. So I was in residential with a lot of people who had trauma to address in their lives, and so the method used was to address that trauma, but not approach it as this is why you're addicted. The addressing of that kind of past trauma was done as part of the course of treatment, but we weren't doing any kind of let's go back and dive through your past history and find who's to blame for your addiction, because one of the things that we're trying to learn how to do is to stop blaming people for our own behavior and to take responsibility for our own behavior and to not look to other people and build further resentments because we're blaming them for the bad things that are happening in our lives. They go on to say Alcoholics Anonymous is the single most effective treatment for alcoholism. I would argue, this book was originally written about 40 years ago, and so there weren't a lot of other treatment programs at that time. I would argue there are far more options at this point: Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery, other options for people to explore that besides Alcoholics Anonymous. I think the point is that having a fellowship and a spiritual program to follow is the key. Let's see, another thing that stood out to me is there are also many times in the course of recovery that the recovering person will confront specialized problems. It has been demonstrated that professional counseling and therapy can provide assistance in resolving these issues more rapidly and effectively. The most successful form of treatment combines the self-help group with professional treatment. And that's been my experience, is that, and this is what one of the things that I read about in the 12-Step Buddhist when I was going through that book, is that author found it most effective to combine his self-help treatment with and his group treatment with individual counseling. And so I've started to do the same and have found it to be extremely helpful in my ongoing recovery. They talk about good health in general, so sobriety is essential for good health, and good health is essential for sobriety. Good nutrition is vital for recovery. Exercise is important. And time for relaxation should be structured into the life of every recovering person. And this is something that, unfortunately, I think a lot of us forget sometimes, that it's okay to build in time to relax, to have fun, to play, to do those things that allow our brain to rest and be easy. It doesn't always have to be work. Sometimes relaxation is the work you have to do at that moment. And finally, they go on to say recovery also involves development of new and more meaningful social networks. So very important to build the fellowship around you of like-minded people, not only people in recovery, but people in general who want to go through life the same way you are. And that's where they get to what they talk about here regarding the spiritual program. It's difficult to recover from an addiction without what is referred to in AA as a spiritual program. A life that includes wholesome living, uplifting relationships, commitment to values outside of oneself, and spiritual growth supports long-term health and sobriety. And that, I think, has been one of the most important things to me, is having a life, having a situation where spiritual growth is an enormous part of what I'm doing and really the foundation of everything that I'm trying to do on a daily basis. So that's it for what Gorski and Miller have to say about recovery. In the next chapter that we get to, we'll talk a little bit about post-acute withdrawal syndrome, which a lot of people might be familiar with, and is a huge part of some of the challenges that we experience in early recovery. I'll see you tomorrow.